She stood in front of the most feared mafia husband in the city holding divorce papers. And for the first time, he looked afraid of losing something. The Moretti mansion stood above the city, like a monument built for power instead of love. Massive white stone walls surrounded the estate. Armed guards rotated through security gates 24 hours a day. Expensive black cars lined the curved driveway beneath golden lights that illuminated perfection from the outside. People admired the mansion constantly. Women envied the life inside it. Men feared the man who owned it. But nobody ever noticed how quiet the house truly was. That was the emotional hook. Because emotional loneliness becomes invisible once luxury hides it well enough. Vanessa Moretti stood near the giant bedroom windows overlooking the city skyline, while rain slid slowly across the glass. The silk sleeves covering her arms reflected the soft chandelier light behind her, but nothing about the room felt warm despite its beauty. The mansion contained everything money could buy: rare paintings, imported marble floors, private chefs, luxury closets larger than normal apartments. Yet somehow, every room still felt emotionally empty, especially at night, especially when Luca returned home. That was the intellectual hook, because some marriages die quietly long before anyone admits they are broken. Vanessa closed her eyes briefly, listening to the distant sound of another car entering the estate gates below. She already knew who it was before security announced his arrival through the communication system. Luca Moretti, her husband, the man newspapers called untouchable, the man politicians secretly obeyed, the man entire criminal organizations feared enough to avoid speaking his name carelessly, and somehow the same man who no longer noticed his wife disappearing emotionally beside him. That realization no longer made Vanessa angry, only tired. That was the emotional hook, because exhaustion becomes more dangerous than heartbreak the moment someone stops hoping things will change. The office desk behind her remained covered with legal documents she spent months preparing secretly: divorce filings, financial separation papers, travel records, quiet arrangements built carefully over time, while Luca remained distracted by wars, territory, money, loyalty, and power. At first, preparing the papers terrified her. Now, they simply felt necessary. That frightened her most, because fear disappearing from a marriage usually means love disappeared first. That was the intellectual hook, because people stay trapped longest inside relationships they're still emotionally fighting for. Vanessa walked slowly across the massive bedroom toward the desk. Her movements remained calm, elegant, controlled. Years beside Luca Moretti taught her emotional control very well, not because he physically hurt her. Luca rarely needed physical intimidation. His silence alone controlled entire rooms. That was what outsiders misunderstood about powerful men like him. The danger existed inside their presence long before violence entered anything. That was the emotional hook, because the most intimidating people are often the ones who never need to raise their voice. Vanessa touched the edge of the divorce papers carefully. 6 years. 6 years of marriage built around absence disguised as protection. At the beginning, she truly believed Luca loved her. Perhaps he did, in his own damaged way. Back then, he used to look at her differently, less distracted, less emotionally unreachable. There had been moments where she saw warmth beneath the cold discipline controlling him. Small moments, rare moments, enough to make her stay longer than she should have. That was the intellectual hook, because people survive unhappy relationships through memories of who someone used to be. But power changed Luca slowly. Or perhaps power only revealed who he truly was underneath everything else. Business calls replaced conversations. Security meetings replaced dinners. Violence replaced emotional vulnerability. And eventually, Vanessa stopped trying to compete with the empire he loved more than anything else. That surrender happened quietly. No screaming, no dramatic breakdown. Just silence growing larger every year. That was the emotional hook, because emotional neglect destroys people slowly enough that they often do not realize they are disappearing until very little remains. The bedroom door opened behind her. Vanessa did not turn immediately. She already recognized Luca's footsteps after years together. Calm, measured, controlled. Even exhaustion never disrupted the dangerous composure surrounding him. The room itself seemed to react whenever he entered. Everything became sharper, more careful. That was the intellectual hook. Because real power changes environments before words are ever spoken. Luca removed his dark overcoat slowly while one of the security men disappeared silently outside the bedroom again. Expensive black fabric rested perfectly against his tall frame, untouched by the rain outside. Everything about him projected control. Perfectly adjusted cufflinks. Cold gray eyes. Emotion hidden so deeply most people believed it did not exist at all. The city feared Luca Moretti because he never appeared emotional. Emotion made men vulnerable. Luca built his entire empire avoiding vulnerability. That was the emotional hook. Because people raised around violence often confuse emotional distance with strength. "You're awake," Luca said calmly. Vanessa almost smiled at the irony. He sounded mildly surprised to find his wife awake inside their own bedroom at midnight. That alone explained their marriage perfectly. That was the intellectual hook. Because relationships collapse when presence becomes unusual instead of expected. Vanessa finally turned toward him slowly. Luca loosened his ties slightly while studying her with quiet observation. Not affection. Assessment. He always assessed rooms first. Even his own home. Especially his own home. Years inside organized crime trained him to identify threats automatically. Unfortunately, he never learned how to recognize emotional damage with the same urgency. That was the emotional hook. Because some men notice danger everywhere except inside the people they love. "You missed dinner again," Vanessa said softly. No accusation existed inside her voice anymore. That caught Luca's attention immediately. Because anger would have been normal. Calmness felt unfamiliar. "I was working." The answer came automatically. Routine. Predictable. Vanessa nodded once. Of course he was. Luca always worked. Always protected the empire. Always solved problems. Always controlled outcomes. Except the one standing directly in front of him now. That was the intellectual hook. Because people obsessed with controlling the world often fail to notice what is collapsing at home. Luca studied her carefully now. Something about her expression unsettled him slightly. Too calm. Too distant. Vanessa moved toward the desk quietly and picked up the papers resting there. The sound of paper shifting inside the silent room somehow felt louder than thunder. Luca's eyes followed the movement instantly, then narrowed, not emotionally, instinctively, because years surviving dangerous environments taught him to recognize moments before they fully happened. That was the emotional hook. Because powerful men sense disruption before understanding it. Vanessa looked down briefly at the papers in her hands. Her fingers no longer trembled. That surprised her. Months ago, she could barely imagine this moment without panic. Now she only felt sadness, not dramatic sadness. The quiet kind that arrives after disappointment lasts too long. That was the intellectual hook. Because grief inside relationships often begins long before separation actually happens. "I'm leaving, Luca." The room became completely still. Not silent. Still. Even the air itself felt frozen suddenly. Luca did not move immediately. But something changed behind his eyes. Tiny. Almost invisible. Yet Vanessa noticed it instantly after years beside him. Shock. Real shock. That was the emotional hook. Because emotionally unavailable people often believe the people beside them will never actually leave. His gaze dropped slowly toward the papers in her hands. Divorce documents. Official. Prepared carefully. Final. For several seconds, Luca simply stared at them without speaking. And for the first time since Vanessa met him, he looked uncertain. That uncertainty disturbed the room more than anger would have. Because men like Luca Moretti were never uncertain. That was the intellectual hook. Because certainty becomes part of power the longer people fear you. Vanessa watched him carefully. Part of her expected rage. Another part expected control. Maybe threats. Maybe manipulation. Instead, Luca remained completely motionless, as if his mind temporarily stopped processing the situation correctly. That frightened her more than shouting would have. Because silence around dangerous men usually meant something far worse was happening internally. That was the emotional hook. Because controlled men become most unpredictable when emotions finally break through discipline. "You're serious." It was not a question. Vanessa nodded slowly. Yes. Luca's jaw tightened almost invisibly. The city feared him. His enemies obeyed consequences. Entire criminal networks adjusted decisions around his reactions. Yet none of that power mattered inside this moment, because divorce papers could not be threatened away like enemies. That was the intellectual hook. Because emotional loss ignores status, money, and fear completely. Vanessa stepped closer carefully. Not emotionally. Respectfully. I can't live like this anymore. Luca's eyes lifted toward her immediately. And suddenly, beneath all the cold control surrounding him, Vanessa saw something she had not seen in years. Fear. Not physical fear. Emotional fear. The kind, powerful men spend entire lives hiding from. That was the emotional hook. Because losing love terrifies emotionally damaged people more than violence ever could. You have everything, Luca said quietly. The statement alone explained everything wrong between them. Luxury, protection, security, status, everything except emotional connection. Vanessa felt sadness settle deeper inside her chest. Because Luca genuinely believed those things should have been enough. That was the intellectual hook. Because some people provide materially, because they never learn how to love emotionally. I have a mansion, Vanessa answered softly. Not a marriage. The words hit harder than anger, harder than accusations. Because they were true. Luca looked away briefly for the first time since entering the room. That small movement alone revealed more emotion than most people ever witnessed from him publicly. Vanessa suddenly realized something devastating then. Luca never truly understood how lonely she had become. Not because he did not care, because he genuinely did not know how to see emotional pain correctly. That realization complicated her anger instantly. That was the emotional hook. Because understanding someone's emotional damage makes leaving them far more painful. Rain continued sliding across the massive windows behind them while silence expanded again. But now the silence felt different. Fragile, unstable, dangerous in a completely different way. Luca finally stepped closer, slowly, carefully, like approaching something already breaking. His eyes remained fixed on the divorce papers still resting in Vanessa's hands. And for the first time in years, the Ruthless Don looked less like a king controlling an empire, and more like a man terrified of losing the only person who ever saw him as human. That was the intellectual hook. Because power becomes meaningless the moment someone important decides to walk away from it. Vanessa's breathing tightened slightly as Luca stopped directly in front of her. The room felt smaller suddenly. Heavy with years of silence, neither of them fully understood how to fix anymore. Then Luca spoke quietly, and what he said next was something nobody in the city would have ever believed capable of leaving Luca Moretti's mouth. Because instead of threatening her to stay, the Ruthless Don looked at his wife holding divorce papers and begged her not to leave. He could silence enemies with one order, but he did not know how to stop his own wife from walking away. The words Vanessa left hanging in the air did not disappear after she spoke them. They remained inside the room like damage neither of them understood how to repair. Luca Moretti stood motionless in front of his wife, while the divorce papers rested between them, like a weapon more dangerous than any gun ever pointed at him. Because bullets, threats, and enemies follow predictable rules. Love did not. That was the emotional hook. Because emotionally damaged people fear vulnerability more than violence. Vanessa watched him carefully. For years, she had seen powerful men lower their eyes around Luca. Politicians changed decisions after one private meeting with him. Police commissioners ignored evidence because Luca's influence reached deeper than law itself. Business leaders smiled publicly while secretly obeying behind closed doors. The city moved differently around Luca Moretti. Fear altered everything. That was the intellectual hook. Because true power exists when people obey without needing to be reminded why. But standing inside their bedroom now, none of that power seemed useful. Because Vanessa was not afraid of him anymore. And Luca had no idea how to survive that reality. Rain continued tapping softly against the massive windows, while silence stretched painfully between them. Luca's expression remained controlled externally, but Vanessa noticed the tension tightening around his jaw. Small signs, tiny fractures. Most people would never recognize them. She did. That was the emotional hook, because the people closest to emotionally controlled men learn how to read emotions hidden beneath silence. Luca finally looked down at the divorce papers again. Official signatures. Legal arrangements. Finality. The documents felt unreal in his hands despite the physical weight of them. Vanessa had prepared this quietly. For months, inside his own house, while he remained distracted building an empire large enough to control everyone except the woman beside him. That realization unsettled him more than anger ever could. That was the intellectual hook. Because powerful people rarely notice emotional collapse until it reaches irreversible stages. You planned this behind my back. The words sounded calm. Too calm. Vanessa recognized the danger immediately. Luca became coldest when emotions threatened his control. That was how he survived his entire life. That was the emotional hook. Because men raised around violence often treat emotional pain like another enemy needing suppression. I planned it alone, Vanessa answered softly. Because I've been alone for years. The statement landed harder than accusation. Luca turned away briefly, pacing toward the fireplace while trying to reorganize thoughts that suddenly refused to obey him properly. This was unfamiliar territory. Negotiations made sense. Threats made sense. War made sense. But emotional abandonment, that felt chaotic. And Luca hated chaos. That was the intellectual hook. Because people obsessed with control become helpless inside emotional uncertainty. He poured himself a drink without asking whether Vanessa wanted one. Habit, routine, another small detail, revealing how emotionally disconnected their marriage had become. Vanessa noticed it immediately. So, did Luca a second later. That tiny realization irritated him more than it should have, because suddenly every ordinary behavior inside their relationship looked different through her pain. That was the emotional hook. Because relationships begin collapsing the moment small neglect becomes impossible to ignore. Luca leaned one hand against the marble fireplace while city lights reflected dimly across the glass in his hand. You should have talked to me. Vanessa almost laughed. Not cruelly, sadly, because he genuinely believed communication had still existed between them. That realization hurt more than anger. I tried, she said quietly. Luca's eyes lifted toward her immediately, and suddenly memories began returning whether he wanted them or not. Vanessa, waiting awake for him at dinner tables he never reached. Conversations interrupted by business calls. Anniversaries postponed because violence somewhere in the city demanded his attention. Her silence growing longer every year. At the time, he thought stability mattered more than emotional closeness. Protection mattered more. Luxury mattered more. Now, he wasn't certain anymore. That was the intellectual hook. Because some people confuse providing safety with providing love. Luca Moretti had been raised inside a world where affection rarely existed without conditions attached to it. His father ruled through fear. His mother survived through silence. Weakness inside the Moretti family carried consequences. Children learned emotional restraint before they learned trust. That environment shaped Luca long before power ever touched him. That was the emotional hook. Because children raised without emotional warmth often grow into adults unable to recognize emotional starvation in others. Luca remembered being 14 years old and watching his father beat a man unconscious over betrayal while the entire family ate dinner nearby. Without reacting, no one spoke. No one intervened. Emotion inside the house was treated like weakness. Fear created order. Violence maintained loyalty. Control ensured survival. Those lessons never left him. That was the intellectual hook. Because people raised inside violence often mistake emotional detachment for strength. And now Vanessa stood in front of him asking for something he never truly learned how to give properly. Emotional presence. Not protection. Not money. Not status. Presence. Luca suddenly realized how little he actually understood about love outside ownership and responsibility. That realization felt deeply uncomfortable, because emotional vulnerability could not be solved through authority. That was the emotional hook. Because the strongest men often become emotionally helpless once control stops working. Vanessa walked slowly toward the bedroom doors, needing distance from the tension suffocating the room. The mansion suddenly felt colder than usual. Too large, too quiet. Every expensive object surrounding them now looked meaningless beside the divorce papers still resting on the desk. Luca watched her carefully. Something inside him tightened, painfully watching her move away. The feeling irritated him immediately, not because he lacked emotion, because emotions like this made him feel weak. That was the intellectual hook, because emotionally controlled people often resent the feelings they cannot dominate. You're overreacting. The moment the words left his mouth, Vanessa closed her eyes briefly. Not angry, exhausted. That reaction unsettled Luca instantly, because she did not even have energy left to argue anymore. That was worse than shouting. That was the emotional hook, because indifference is often the final stage of emotional disappointment. Vanessa turned toward him slowly. "For years, I convinced myself things would get better," she said quietly. "I defended you to everyone. I defended this marriage to myself, even when I stopped feeling loved inside it." Luca remained silent, because interrupting her suddenly felt dangerous in ways violence never had. Vanessa continued, "You gave me houses, jewelry, security, money, but none of those things ever made me feel important to you." The truth inside her voice cut deeper than accusations, because Luca realized she genuinely believed it, and perhaps worse. She was right. That was the intellectual hook. Because material comfort cannot replace emotional intimacy, no matter how expensive it becomes. Outside the bedroom windows, lightning flashed briefly across the dark sky. While Luca's thoughts moved faster than he could organize, he spent years building an empire capable of controlling every threat around him. Yet somehow, he failed to notice the emotional collapse happening directly beside him every night. How? That question disturbed him deeply, because Luca Moretti noticed everything. Or at least, he believed he did. That was the emotional hook, because people obsessed with external threats often ignore emotional damage completely. Vanessa watched conflict moving behind his expression now, not visible enough for strangers, but enough for her. Luca looked angry, but beneath the anger, fear existed too. Fear of losing control, fear of losing her, fear of facing emotional truths he spent years avoiding. That combination made him dangerous and fragile at the same time. That was the intellectual hook, because pride and desperation create volatile emotions inside powerful people. "You think leaving fixes this?" Luca asked quietly. Vanessa looked toward the city lights outside the windows before answering. "No," she admitted softly. "I think staying destroys me." The room fell silent again, because there was no manipulation inside her words, only honesty. And honesty frightened Luca more than lies ever could. That was the emotional hook, because truth becomes terrifying once it exposes emotional failure clearly. Luca moved toward her slowly now, not threateningly, almost uncertainly. That alone felt unnatural. The city knew Luca Moretti as decisive, ruthless, emotionally untouchable, but none of those qualities helped him here. Vanessa looked up at him carefully, and for the first time in years, Luca looked emotionally lost. That realization shook her unexpectedly, because part of her still remembered the man he used to be before power consumed everything else inside him. That was the intellectual hook, because old love survives longest inside memory. "You should have told me you were this unhappy," Luca said quietly. Vanessa stared at him for several seconds, then answered with devastating calmness. "You stopped listening a long time ago." The words shattered something invisible between them, because Luca knew exactly when it happened. Not one moment. Hundreds of moments. Missed dinners. Ignored conversations. Emotional absences disguised as work. He thought there would always be more time later. That assumption suddenly felt catastrophic. That was the emotional hook, because people lose relationships slowly while believing they still have time to fix them. Luca turned away sharply, frustration building beneath his controlled exterior now. Not frustration at Vanessa, at himself, a feeling he hated deeply, because self-blame required emotional accountability, and accountability felt dangerously close to weakness. That was the intellectual hook, because emotionally guarded people often react to guilt with anger first. "You think this is easy for me?" Luca asked coldly. Vanessa's expression softened slightly then, not with forgiveness, with understanding. And somehow, that understanding hurt him more than judgment would have, because she finally saw him clearly now, emotionally damaged, not emotionally absent. That was the emotional hook, because being understood exposes emotional wounds people spent years hiding. You don't know how to love anything without controlling it, Vanessa said quietly. Luca's breathing slowed instantly. The statement struck too close to truth, because control had shaped every part of his existence since childhood. Control prevented betrayal. Control created survival. Control maintained order. But Vanessa's words forced another realization into his mind now. Maybe control also destroyed intimacy. That thought unsettled him deeply. That was the intellectual hook. Because the habits people build to survive often become the same habits destroying their relationships later. Vanessa stepped toward the bedroom door again, and suddenly Luca felt panic rise beneath his composure for the first time in years. Their marriage did not collapse in one moment. It disappeared slowly through years of silence. The confession lingered inside the room long after Vanessa spoke it. She no longer loved the man Luca had become. Those words did not feel dramatic. They felt exhausted. And somehow, exhaustion frightened Luca Moretti more than hatred ever could, because hatred still carried emotion. Exhaustion meant emotional surrender. That was the emotional hook. Because people stop fighting for love the moment they believe nobody is listening anymore. Luca stood motionless near the fireplace while Vanessa quietly left the bedroom, leaving him alone with something he had spent his entire life avoiding: self-reflection. The mansion remained silent around him, but for the first time in years, the silence no longer felt peaceful. It felt accusatory. Every room suddenly carried memories he ignored for too long. That was the intellectual hook. Because emotional damage becomes impossible to overlook once someone finally names aloud. Vanessa walked slowly through the massive hallway upstairs, her fingers brushing lightly against the cold marble walls as distant rain continued outside. She should have felt relieved after finally speaking the truth. Instead, she felt hollow, because endings rarely feel empowering when love once existed genuinely. And love had existed once. That reality complicated everything. That was the emotional hook, because leaving someone becomes harder when you still remember who they used to be. Years earlier, Luca Moretti had not looked emotionally unreachable. Dangerous, yes. Controlled, absolutely. But not emotionally absent. Back then, Vanessa saw ambition inside him instead of obsession. He used to hold doors open for her himself despite security teams surrounding them constantly. He remembered small details about her favorite restaurants. He listened when she spoke about meaningless things simply because her happiness seemed important to him then. Those memories survived inside her painfully now, because they proved Luca was not always cold. That was the intellectual hook. Because relationships become most painful when people slowly transform into strangers instead of changing overnight. Vanessa still remembered the first time Luca brought her to the Moretti estate years ago. The mansion intimidated her immediately. Too large, too guarded, too quiet. Yet Luca noticed her discomfort that night and softened around her in ways nobody else ever witnessed publicly. He had looked at her differently then, not like property. Not like responsibility, like peace. That was the emotional hook. Because emotionally damaged people often love sincerely before power teaches them to fear vulnerability again. But power changed Luca slowly after marriage. Or perhaps responsibility did. The empire expanded. Enemies multiplied. Violence increased. And little by little, the man Vanessa loved disappeared beneath layers of control and paranoia. At first, she excused everything. Long nights became temporary sacrifices. Missed dinners became understandable. Canceled vacations became necessary business obligations. She defended him constantly. To friends. To family. Mostly to herself. That was the intellectual hook. Because people trapped in unhappy relationships often become experts at explaining away their pain. Vanessa entered the empty upstairs library quietly and stared toward the dark city beyond the giant windows. The room carried memories too. One anniversary dinner, 3 years ago. She spent hours preparing for it because Luca promised he would finally take one evening away from business. He never arrived. Instead, armed men stormed to the mansion after midnight because one of Luca's rivals attempted moving against a shipment downtown. Luca spent the entire night handling violence, while Vanessa sat alone beside untouched candles until sunrise. He apologized the next morning with diamonds. Not conversation. Not emotional honesty. Diamonds. That was the emotional hook. Because gifts become meaningless the moment they replace emotional presence. At the time, Vanessa smiled politely and accepted them anyway. Not because she cared about jewelry. Because she still believed effort inside marriage mattered. She still believed things could improve eventually. That hope kept her alive emotionally for years. Until it didn't anymore. That was the intellectual hook. Because relationships usually die after hope disappears, not after love disappears. Downstairs, Luca remained standing alone inside the bedroom while old memories attacked him unexpectedly now. Small moments, tiny details. Vanessa waiting awake on couches while he returned home after sunrise. Her excitement fading every time business interrupted plans. The increasing quietness around her over the years. He noticed the silence. He simply misunderstood it completely. Luca believed quietness meant stability, not emotional collapse. That realization unsettled him deeply now, because suddenly everything looked different. That was the emotional hook. Because hindsight becomes brutal once people realize they ignored obvious pain for years. Luca poured another drink slowly, though he barely tasted it. His father once told him something when he was 16 years old. Fear keeps people loyal longer than love. Luca believed that for most of his life. Inside criminal organizations, it was true. Fear created order. Fear prevented betrayal. Fear maintained power. But now another thought disturbed him. Fear may control loyalty, but it destroys intimacy. That was the intellectual hook. Because relationships cannot survive where emotional safety does not exist. Vanessa eventually stopped arguing with him years ago. At the time, Luca appreciated that change. Less conflict, less emotional complication, peaceful silence. Now he understood the terrifying truth behind it. She did not stop arguing because she felt happy. She stopped because she felt unheard. That realization hit harder than any threat ever had. That was the emotional hook. Because indifference often grows from disappointment repeated too many times. The mansion staff noticed the emotional distance too over the years. Nobody spoke about it openly. People inside Luca Moretti's world survived through silence. But they saw everything. Vanessa eating dinners alone regularly. Luca taking calls during family events. Security teams surrounding her everywhere, while she somehow still looked emotionally abandoned. Luxury disguised loneliness beautifully from the outside. That was the intellectual hook. Because emotional suffering becomes invisible once wealth surrounds it. Vanessa lowered herself slowly into one of the library chairs, exhaustion pressing heavily against her chest now. Part of her hated herself for leaving. That guilt remained unavoidable. Because despite everything, Luca never stopped protecting her physically. He never betrayed her, never cheated publicly, never allowed anyone to disrespect her. In his mind, those things proved devotion. But Vanessa needed emotional connection more than protection. And Luca never understood the difference. That was the emotional hook. Because some people protect the body while neglecting the heart completely. She remembered another moment suddenly. 2 winters earlier, Vanessa suffered severe pneumonia and spent days isolated inside the mansion recovering while Luca handled negotiations overseas. He called repeatedly, sent private doctors, expanded security around the estate. Yet he never came home himself. At the time, Vanessa finally understood something devastating. Luca genuinely believed providing solutions emotionally replaced presence. That realization changed her permanently. That was the intellectual hook. Because emotionally unavailable people often substitute efficiency for intimacy. Downstairs, Luca entered his private office, slowly while thoughts continued spiraling in ways unfamiliar to him. The room represented everything he built. Control, power, structure. Maps covered walls displaying territory movements throughout the city. Financial reports remained stacked across his desk beside encrypted phones connected to judges, politicians, businessmen, and criminal networks. Everything here obeyed him. Everything made sense. Except Vanessa leaving. That alone exposed a terrifying weakness inside him. Not weakness in power, weakness in understanding emotion itself. That was the emotional hook, because people can master entire worlds while remaining emotionally illiterate. Luca sat heavily behind the desk, staring at security reports without reading them. For years, he believed sacrifice justified everything. Long hours, violence, emotional absence. He convinced himself building a stronger empire protected Vanessa indirectly. But now another realization surfaced slowly. Maybe the empire became more important to him than the marriage itself. That thought filled him with something dangerously close to guilt. Luca hated guilt, because guilt forced accountability. That was the intellectual hook, because accountability becomes painful once people recognize their own emotional failures. Upstairs, Vanessa opened one of the drawers inside the library desk and removed old photographs she had hidden there years ago. Images from happier times. Luca smiling slightly beside her during vacations before the empire expanded aggressively. Quiet mornings together before endless meetings consumed him. Moments where love looked simple, possible, real. Vanessa stared at the photographs silently while tears finally burned behind her eyes. Not because she wanted to stay, because grieving love felt unavoidable even when leaving became necessary. That was the emotional hook. Because ending a relationship does not erase the good memories trapped inside it. She wondered whether Luca would have changed if she fought harder years earlier, then immediately hated herself for the thought, because she had fought, repeatedly, until exhaustion replaced effort. That was the intellectual hook. Because emotionally neglected people often blame themselves for eventually giving up. Hours passed quietly throughout the mansion. Separate rooms, separate thoughts, separate loneliness. A marriage still legally intact, but emotionally fractured beyond recognition. For the first time in years, Luca truly understood how isolated Vanessa became inside his world. The realization sickened him, because she had not asked for wealth, or status, or fear. She asked for him, and somehow he failed to notice she stopped receiving that long ago. That was the emotional hook. Because people rarely appreciate emotional presence until absence becomes permanent. Near dawn, Vanessa finally returned to the bedroom silently, while Luca remained awake near the windows overlooking the city. Neither spoke immediately. The emotional exhaustion between them felt too heavy for words now. Vanessa moved toward the closet slowly and removed a suitcase hidden behind several dresses. Luca's eyes followed the movement instantly, then dropped toward the open suitcase beside the bed. Reality suddenly became physical. She was truly leaving. That realization tightened something violently inside his chest. That was the intellectual hook, because emotional loss only becomes real once movement begins. Vanessa folded clothes carefully into the suitcase without looking directly at him. Calm, quiet, final. Luca watched her silently. And for the first time in years, genuine panic started breaking through his control. Not anger, not pride, fear, because despite all his power, he no longer knew how to stop his marriage from ending. That was the emotional hook, because emotionally damaged people often recognize love's value only when abandonment becomes real. But while Vanessa prepared quietly to leave the Moretti mansion forever, someone else inside the city was already watching Luca Moretti's collapsing marriage very carefully. And somewhere beyond the safety of the estate walls, a dangerous enemy had finally discovered the ruthless Don's greatest weakness, his wife. The moment she tried leaving his world, his enemies decided she would never escape it. The Moretti mansion no longer felt emotionally broken. It felt hunted. Vanessa sensed the shift before anyone explained it to her directly. The hallways remained quiet, but the silence had changed shape. Security guards moved more aggressively through the estate. Black vehicles rotated outside the gates throughout the night. Conversations stopped whenever she entered rooms. Fear lived openly inside the mansion now. And for the first time, Vanessa realized something terrifying. Leaving Luca Moretti's world was not as simple as walking away from a marriage, because his world did not release people easily. That was the emotional hook. Because dangerous empires do not separate love from ownership once someone becomes emotionally important. 2 days passed after Luca discovered the divorce papers. Vanessa still intended to leave, but now every attempt felt delayed by invisible pressure surrounding the estate. Drivers changed unexpectedly. Security escorts followed her movements more closely. Even shopping trips suddenly required arm protection. At first, she believed Luca simply refused accepting the separation emotionally. Then she overheard one sentence downstairs that changed everything. Vincent Cruz knows about the wife. The words froze her instantly, because everyone inside organized crime feared Vincent Cruz differently than they feared Luca Moretti. Luca ruled through structure. Vincent ruled through chaos. That was the intellectual hook, because controlled violence is terrifying, but unpredictable violence is worse. Vanessa stood silently near the staircase, while two of Luca's men lowered their voices immediately after noticing her presence. Too late. She already heard enough. Vincent Cruz, one of Luca's oldest rivals, a man connected to disappearances, political corruption, drug routes, and brutal retaliation stretching across several states. Unlike Luca, Vincent enjoyed fear publicly. He wanted enemies emotionally destabilized before destroying them completely. And now, he knew about Vanessa. That realization made cold panic spread through her chest. That was the emotional hook. Because people can survive dangerous marriages longer than they can survive becoming leverage inside mafia wars. Later that evening, Luca entered the private dining room where Vanessa sat untouched beside dinner growing cold across the table. He noticed immediately she looked different. More alert, more afraid, and Luca hated himself instantly for recognizing the reason. That was the intellectual hook. Because guilt becomes unavoidable once someone you love starts fearing the world you created. You heard something, Luca said quietly. Vanessa looked toward him carefully. Who's Vincent Cruz? The question tightened the atmosphere inside the room immediately. Luca's jaw hardened slightly, though his expression stayed controlled. Someone you don't need to worry about. Vanessa almost laughed at the answer, not because it sounded comforting, because it sounded familiar. For years, Luca handled every emotional conversation the same way. By controlling information instead of sharing truth. That was the emotional hook, because emotionally unavailable people often mistake secrecy for protection. He knows about me, doesn't he? Vanessa asked softly. Luca remained silent for one dangerous second too long. That silence answered everything. Vanessa lowered her eyes briefly, exhaustion mixing with fear now. This is exactly why I wanted to leave. Luca stepped closer slowly. And leaving now makes you vulnerable. There it is again, she whispered. Control disguised as concern. The words landed sharply between them, because part of Luca already feared she was right. That was the intellectual hook. Because protection becomes emotionally suffocating once people lose the freedom to choose it. Luca sat across from her heavily, rubbing one hand slowly against his jaw, while tension built beneath his calm exterior. For years, he solved problems through intimidation, strategy, violence, or money. But Vanessa's fear could not be eliminated that way. And somehow that terrified him more than Vincent Cruz himself. That was the emotional hook. Because powerful men become helpless when they cannot protect the emotional safety of the people they love. Across the city, Vincent Cruz reviewed surveillance photographs spread across a glass table inside his penthouse office. Vanessa entering charity events beside Luca. Vanessa alone inside restaurant terraces. Vanessa walking through gardens at the Moretti estate. Vincent studied each image carefully, thoughtfully, not lustfully, strategically, because Vanessa Moretti was not important for who she was. She mattered because Luca cared. And emotional vulnerabilities inside mafia wars became weapons eventually. That was the intellectual hook. Because enemies do not attack love itself, they attack the fear of losing it. Vincent leaned back slowly while one of his men updated him on Luca's recent behavior. Increased security around the wife. Reduced outside appearances. More direct oversight personally. Vincent smiled faintly. Good. The response unsettled even the men around him. Because Vincent enjoyed watching powerful people become emotionally unstable. That was the emotional hook. Because some predators feed more on fear than violence itself. Back at the estate, Luca transformed the mansion into something closer to a fortress overnight. Additional guards arrived. Security checkpoints doubled. Cameras expanded across surrounding roads. No visitor entered without approval directly from Luca himself. Vanessa watched the changes with growing frustration and dread. She understood the danger now, but understanding danger did not make losing freedom easier. That was the intellectual hook, because fear and resentment can exist together inside the same relationship. One afternoon, Vanessa attempted leaving the estate alone for the first time in days. Not permanently, just for air, for distance, for something resembling normal life. But before she reached the front gate, 2 guards intercepted her respectfully. Mr. Moretti requested accompaniment outside the property. Vanessa's anger ignited instantly. He requested? Neither guard answered. They didn't need to. Everyone inside the city obeyed Luca Moretti eventually. That was the emotional hook. Because losing freedom feels worse once someone else decides what safety means for you. Vanessa returned inside the mansion furious, finding Luca in his office reviewing financial reports with several men surrounding him. The room fell silent immediately when she entered. Luca dismissed everyone with one glance. The moment they were alone, Vanessa spoke first. "You turned me into a prisoner again." Luca stood slowly behind the desk. "You're being protected." "No," she answered sharply. "I'm being controlled." Luca's patience tightened visibly. Vincent Cruz is watching this house. And whose fault is that? The question hit hard because Luca had no honest offense against it. That was the intellectual hook. Because the truth becomes painful when responsibility cannot be denied anymore. Vanessa moved closer now, emotion finally breaking through her exhaustion. "I wanted freedom, Luca, not bodyguards following me through hallways." His voice lowered dangerously. "You think I care about appearances right now? I think you care about control more than you care about understanding me." Silence crashed heavily between them after that, because deep down, Luca feared she was right again. That was the emotional hook. Because emotionally damaged people often repeat harmful patterns even while trying to protect someone. For the first time in years, Luca's empire no longer held his complete attention. Meetings shortened, deals delayed, shipments delegated to trusted men instead of handled personally. Everything now revolved around Vanessa's safety. That terrified his inner circle quietly, because Luca Moretti without emotional distraction was nearly untouchable. Luca Moretti emotionally compromised became unpredictable. That was the intellectual hook, because dangerous organizations weaken the moment leadership becomes emotionally vulnerable. Vanessa noticed a shift too, not just in security. In Luca himself, he watched her constantly now, not possessively alone, fearfully, as if every moment she remained inside the mansion still felt temporary to him. That realization complicated her emotions painfully, because for years she begged emotionally for his attention. Now she finally had it, through danger. That irony felt cruel. That was the emotional hook, because people often receive emotional importance only after becoming impossible to lose safely. One evening, Vanessa wandered into the mansion garden, while guards monitored the property from a careful distance. The cold evening air steadied her thoughts slightly, until she noticed something strange. A black sedan parked across the distant road beyond the estate gates. Still, watching, the car remained there too long. Vanessa's pulse sharpened immediately, and suddenly, the reality of Luca's world stopped feeling distant. Because somewhere inside that vehicle sat people observing her movements like she was part of a war she never chose. That was the intellectual hook. Because fear becomes real the moment danger stops feeling abstract. The sedan eventually drove away slowly, but the emotional damage remained. Vanessa returned inside, shaken in ways she could not fully hide. Luca noticed instantly. Of course he did. "What happened?" She hesitated briefly before answering. There was a car outside. Luca's expression darkened immediately. "Describe it." The calmness in his voice frightened her more than shouting would have, because calmness meant violence was already forming inside his thoughts. That was the emotional hook, because the quietest reactions often come before the most dangerous decisions. Within minutes, guards moved rapidly across the estate, while Luca issued cold instructions through his phone. Vanessa stood nearby watching everything unfold with growing horror. This was the reality she tried escaping for years. Surveillance, threats, weapons, fear controlling every decision. And now she understood something even worse. Leaving Luca emotionally no longer mattered to people like Vincent Cruz, because she had already become valuable. That was the intellectual hook. Because dangerous people stop seeing you as human the moment they realize your emotional value to someone powerful. Later that night, Vanessa found Luca alone inside the downstairs study staring toward security monitors covering the state grounds. Exhaustion weighed heavily across his face now. Not physical exhaustion, emotional strain. And for the first time, Vanessa saw genuine panic beneath his control. That unsettled her deeply, because Luca Moretti rarely feared anything. That was the emotional hook, because seeing fear inside powerful people reveals how deeply they care. "You can't protect me forever," she said quietly. Luca didn't look away from the monitors. "Yes, I can." The answer sounded less confident than determined, like a man trying desperately to convince himself. That was the intellectual hook, because desperate protection often grows from fear of emotional failure. Vanessa studied him silently. "You really think Vincent would hurt me just to get to you?" Luca finally looked toward her then, and the fear inside his eyes answered before words did. "Yes." That single word changed something inside her permanently, because suddenly this was no longer only about divorce, or emotional neglect, or broken marriage. It was survival now. That was the emotional hook, because love becomes terrifying when dangerous people discover it exists. Across the city, Vincent Cruz sat inside another quiet room, reviewing updated surveillance reports from a Moretti estate. One photograph caught his attention most. Vanessa alone in the garden, vulnerable, unprotected emotionally, despite the guards surrounding her physically. Vincent smiled slowly, because emotional weakness always revealed itself eventually. And Luca Moretti had finally developed one that made him dangerous, but also human. That was the intellectual hook, because enemies become most vulnerable at the exact moment they start loving something deeply. Vincent reached for his phone calmly, then gave the order. Not loud, not dramatic, quiet, efficient, the kind of order that changed lives permanently. And before Luca could convince Vanessa to stay, Vincent Cruz made his first move against her. For the first time in his life, the ruthless Don stopped giving orders and started begging. The attack happened too quickly for Vanessa to fully understand it. One moment she stood outside a private art gallery surrounded by security escorts and flashing city traffic. The next, gunfire shattered the afternoon. People screamed. Vehicles swerved violently across the street, and chaos swallowed everything. That was the emotional hook, because violence feels unreal until it suddenly arrives close enough to touch you. Luca's guards reacted instantly, surrounding Vanessa while pulling her toward an armored vehicle parked nearby. The city blurred around her in broken fragments of sound and panic. Someone shoved her downward behind the car door, just as another bullet shattered nearby glass. Vanessa stopped breathing for one terrifying second, not from injury, from realization. This was not fear anymore. This was war. That was the intellectual hook, because mafia violence stops feeling glamorous the moment innocent people become part of it. The attack lasted less than a minute, but emotionally, it changed everything. By the time Luca arrived at the secure location where his men transported Vanessa afterward, his entire empire already moved with violent urgency. Roads closed, surveillance networks activated, armed convoys spread across the city, hunting for Vincent Cruz's shooters. But none of that mattered to Luca the moment he saw Vanessa sitting silently beneath medical lights inside a secure penthouse suite, alive, shaken, terrified. That sight nearly destroyed him. That was the emotional hook, because powerful men can survive threats against themselves, but seeing fear inside the eyes of someone they love breaks something deeper. Vanessa looked up slowly as Luca entered the room. For once, he did not appear untouchable. His suit remained disordered from rushing across the city. His jaw stayed tense with restrained violence. But beneath all of that, fear existed openly now. Real fear. And Vanessa realized something unsettling. Luca Moretti was not angry first. He was terrified. That was the intellectual hook. Because the people who truly love you fear losing you before they seek revenge. Luca crossed the room quickly before stopping directly in front of her. His eyes scanned every visible part of her, as if confirming she remained physically unharmed. "You're bleeding." Vanessa looked down. A small cut stretched across her wrist from shattered glass. Minor, but Luca reacted like the sight physically hurt him. That frightened her almost as much as the attack itself, because she had never seen Luca emotionally exposed before. That was the emotional hook. Because emotionally distant people become overwhelming once their control finally breaks. Doctors attempted speaking, but Luca ignored everyone around him completely. His attention remained fixed only on Vanessa, on the possibility that she could have died. That thought replayed inside his mind repeatedly now, poisoning every other thought beneath it. If the bullets moved differently, if security reacted slower, if she had stood one step closer. Luca stopped the thought immediately, because imagining her dead made something inside him unravel violently. That was the intellectual hook. Because fear of loss exposes emotional truths pride can no longer hide. Vanessa watched him carefully while the room emptied quietly around them. The silence between them felt unfamiliar now. Not cold, fragile. Luca finally lowered himself into the chair beside her slowly, exhaustion and guilt visible across his face for the first time since she met him. "This happened because of me." The admission stunned her more than shouting ever could. Because Luca Moretti never blamed himself publicly. Never. That was the emotional hook. Because powerful men often protect their pride harder than their emotions. Vanessa looked toward the city lights beyond the windows. "This is your world." Luca closed his eyes briefly. "I brought you into it." The guilt inside his voice sounded heavy enough to crush him, and Vanessa realized something painful then. Luca truly believed he failed her. Not emotionally this time. Completely. That was the intellectual hook. Because guilt becomes unbearable when someone finally understands the damage they caused. For years, Vanessa begged silently for emotional connection, while Luca buried himself deeper inside power, violence, and control. Now power itself had nearly gotten her killed. And suddenly, everything Luca built felt meaningless to him. That terrified him more than enemies ever had. That was the emotional hook. Because people change fastest after realizing success cost them the thing they loved most. The following days unfolded differently inside the Moretti empire. Luca became quieter, less aggressive, more distant from the ruthless structure he once controlled effortlessly. Meetings ended early. Executions were delayed or canceled completely. Several violent operations disappeared overnight after Luca ordered them shut down permanently. His men noticed immediately. The empire itself felt unstable now. That was the intellectual hook. Because organizations built on fear begin weakening the moment leadership develops emotional priorities. Vanessa noticed the changes too. Not through announcements, through behavior. Luca stopped forcing conversations. Stopped controlling her movements obsessively. Stopped treating her emotions like obstacles needing management. Instead, he listened, and somehow that change unsettled her more than his anger once did. That was the emotional hook. Because real change feels unfamiliar after years of emotional disappointment. One evening, Vanessa entered the downstairs study quietly and found Luca alone near the fireplace, surrounded by untouched business files. For the first time in years, he looked tired beyond physical exhaustion, emotionally exhausted, the kind of exhaustion powerful people usually hide from everyone. That was the intellectual hook, because emotional vulnerability becomes visible once people stop performing strength constantly. Luca noticed her immediately and stood instinctively, not dominant, almost uncertain. Vanessa moved slowly toward the shelves nearby. "You canceled the eastern routes." Luca's expression tightened slightly. "They caused problems. That business made millions. It also created enemies." The answer carried deeper meaning than finances. Vanessa understood that immediately. Because Luca was no longer speaking only about business. He was speaking about his life. That was the emotional hook. Because emotionally damaged people often express regret indirectly before admitting it honestly. Vanessa studied him carefully in the firelight. "You're changing things because of me." Luca looked at her for a long moment before answering quietly. No. The denial surprised her briefly. Then he continued, I'm changing things because I finally understood what matters. The room fell silent after that, because the honesty inside the statement sounded painfully real. That was the intellectual hook. Because truth becomes powerful when spoken without manipulation behind it. For years, Luca believed luxury compensated for emotional absence. He gave Vanessa Mansion security, wealth, influence, but none of it replaced emotional safety. And now he understood something too late. Vanessa never needed his empire. She needed him. That realization hollowed him out completely. That was the emotional hook. Because people often realize the value of love only after nearly losing it permanently. Luca moved closer slowly, though careful not to overwhelm the fragile calm between them. I thought providing everything meant protecting you. Vanessa's eyes lowered briefly. You gave me beautiful prisons. The words hurt because they were true. Luca accepted the pain without defending himself. That alone showed how much had changed. That was the intellectual hook. Because growth begins the moment people stop protecting themselves from accountability. For several moments, neither spoke. Then Luca said something Vanessa never expected hearing from him. I don't care about the empire anymore. She looked up sharply. Luca's voice remained low, controlled only through effort. I would burn every part of it down if it meant keeping you safe. The confession carried no intimidation, no manipulation, only exhaustion and truth. That frightened Vanessa emotionally because she finally believed him. That was the emotional hook, because the strongest confessions are the ones spoken without expecting forgiveness. Over the following weeks, emotional distance between them shifted carefully, not suddenly, not romantically, slowly, painfully, like two people learning how to exist honestly after years of silence. Luca stopped demanding closeness from Vanessa. Instead, he stayed present. Consistent, patient in ways she never imagined possible from him. That was the intellectual hook. Because genuine love stops forcing outcomes and starts respecting emotional timing. Vanessa began noticing smaller things, too. Luca eating dinner at home instead of disappearing nightly into business meetings. Luca dismissing violent suggestions from his men without discussion. Luca standing silently outside her room after nightmares from the attack left her unable to sleep. Not entering, just staying nearby, protectively. That quiet restraint affected her more than dramatic apologies could have. Because for the first time, Luca's actions no longer centered around control. That was the emotional hook. Because the strongest apology is not spoken through words. It is proven through change. One rainy evening, Vanessa found Luca sitting alone inside the mansion garden beneath the covered terrace. The city lights reflected across wet marble, while tension weighed visibly across his expression. He looked less like a feared Don tonight, more like a man terrified of emotional failure. Vanessa sat across from him, quietly. Luca looked toward her immediately, then away again, as if still afraid she might disappear if he looked too closely. That realization tightened something painful inside her chest. That was the intellectual hook. Because emotionally neglected people often struggle believing love can still exist after damage is done. I know you still might leave, Luca admitted quietly. Vanessa stayed silent. Because honesty deserved honesty now. Luca continued slowly. But I can't force you to stay anymore. The sentence carried more emotional growth than anything else he had said before. Vanessa noticed it immediately. Because Luca Moretti once believed control solved everything. Now he understood love survived only through choice. That was the emotional hook, because real love begins where ownership finally ends. Rain continued softly around them while silence settled naturally instead of painfully for once. Vanessa studied him carefully. The dangerous empire still existed around Luca. The violence, the fear, the blood attached to his name. None of that disappeared overnight. But beneath all of it now, she finally saw the lonely man hidden underneath years of emotional armor. And somehow, understanding him felt dangerous too. That was the intellectual hook. Because empathy complicates emotional pain faster than anger ever could. But while Luca fought desperately to save what remained of their marriage, His empire itself began collapsing quietly around him. Old allies questioned his decisions. Violent rivals sensed weakness. Financial partners feared instability. And inside organized crime, emotional distraction often looked identical to vulnerability. That was the emotional hook. Because ruthless empires do not tolerate leaders who suddenly start choosing love over power. Late that night, one of Luca's most trusted men arrived unexpectedly at the mansion, carrying news severe enough to darken the atmosphere instantly. 3 major operations had turned against Luca within hours. 2 longtime captains disappeared, and someone inside the organization was secretly feeding information directly to Vincent Cruz. Betrayal had entered the empire itself. Luca listened silently while Vanessa watched from across the room. For years, this world always came first. Now, everything was collapsing exactly when he finally tried changing. That irony felt brutally unfair. That was the intellectual hook. Because sometimes people become better only after the systems around them begin breaking apart. Luca dismissed the messenger quietly before turning toward Vanessa. And for the first time since she met him, the ruthless Don looked emotionally exhausted instead of powerful. Because he finally understood the truth too late. Empires built on fear could not survive love easily. And just when Vanessa began questioning her decision to leave, Luca's empire started collapsing around them. The man who once ruled the city suddenly realized power could not protect the one person he loved. The Moretti Empire began collapsing quietly, not publicly at first. From the outside, Luca Moretti still looked untouchable. His businesses continued operating across the city. Politicians still answered his calls. Police captains still avoided crossing him. Expensive black vehicles still moved through the streets, carrying the same dangerous reputation attached to his name. But beneath the surface, cracks were spreading everywhere. That was the intellectual hook. Because powerful empires rarely collapse loudly in the beginning, they weakened silently from the inside first. Luca felt it immediately. Shipments disappeared unexpectedly. Longtime allies stopped responding directly. Financial routes experienced sudden delays no one could explain clearly. And worst of all, fear inside his organization had started changing shape. For years, his men feared disappointing him. Now they feared his weakness. That difference terrified Luca more than betrayal itself. That was the emotional hook. Because fear stops creating loyalty the moment people sense instability in the person they once feared most. Vanessa watched the transformation slowly unfold around him over the following weeks. Luca barely slept. Meetings stretched late into the night, while tension consumed every room inside the mansion. Armed guards doubled around the property after repeated attacks targeted Moretti warehouses and financial operations throughout the city. Violence followed his empire everywhere now. And for the first time, Luca looked exhausted by it. That unsettled Vanessa deeply, because she had never imagined a man like Luca Moretti capable of emotional exhaustion. That was the intellectual hook. Because people who build their identity around control eventually collapse under the pressure of maintaining it. One evening, Vanessa entered Luca's office quietly and found him staring across a table covered in security reports, maps, and photographs. He didn't notice her immediately. That alone revealed how distracted he had become. Luca Moretti once noticed everything. Now stress consumed him faster than awareness. That was the emotional hook. Because emotional pressure weakens even the sharpest instincts over time. Vanessa stepped closer slowly. "You haven't slept." Luca rubbed one hand tiredly against his face before answering. "Too much happening." The response sounded hollow. Not cold, just drained. Vanessa studied him carefully beneath the dim office lighting. Dark circles shadowed beneath his eyes now. His shoulders carried visible tension constantly. Even his movements lacked the calm precision that once defined him completely. For the first time, he looked human instead of untouchable. That realization changed something inside her. That was the intellectual hook. Because vulnerability forces people to see powerful men differently. Luca noticed her watching him and immediately straightened slightly, instinctively trying to rebuild composure. Vanessa recognized the reaction instantly. Even now, he struggled showing weakness naturally. That was the emotional hook. Because emotionally damaged people often hide pain automatically, even from those they love. What happened? She asked quietly. Luca hesitated briefly before answering honestly. Another warehouse got hit. Vanessa's chest tightened. Anyone hurt? Yes. The silence after that answer felt heavier than shouting, because violence no longer sounded distant inside their lives. It sounded personal now. That was the intellectual hook. Because danger becomes emotionally real once it starts carrying names and consequences. Luca leaned back slowly into the chair, exhaustion weighing visibly across him. For years, I thought fear made people loyal. Vanessa remained quiet, because she already understood where the conversation was heading. Luca looked toward the city lights outside the office windows. But fear only works while people believe you're stronger than everything else. His voice lowered slightly. And now they know I care about something. Vanessa understood immediately. Something, meaning her. That realization carried painful weight inside the room. That was the emotional hook. Because becoming emotionally important to someone dangerous often feels terrifying instead of romantic. Across the city, rival organizations continued pressing harder against the weakening Moretti empire. Vincent Cruz moved strategically now, avoiding direct war, while poisoning Luca's structure from within. Bribes, manipulation, fear, promises of protection. One by one, loyalty inside Luca's empire began fracturing, because men who once obeyed through fear alone no longer trusted the future under Luca's leadership. That was the intellectual hook. Because organizations built on fear eventually collapsed from the same fear that created them. Inside the mansion, Vanessa experienced Luca's world more deeply than ever before. Not the luxury, not the wealth, the loneliness. Late-night meetings filled with distrust. Bodyguards constantly watching shadows. People obeying Luca instantly while secretly fearing him behind his back. No real friendships. No emotional safety. No peace. And suddenly Vanessa understood something she never fully saw before. Luca built an empire powerful enough to control the city, but too emotionally empty to protect himself from isolation. That realization hurt unexpectedly. That was the emotional hook. Because sometimes the people who hurt others most are also deeply broken themselves. One stormy evening, Luca received news severe enough to shake the entire mansion. Another trusted captain disappeared. Large amounts of money vanished through hidden accounts, and evidence suggested someone close to Luca had secretly worked with Vincent Cruz for months. Betrayal inside the inner circle. The worst kind. That was the intellectual hook. Because betrayal from enemies creates anger. Betrayal from trusted people creates paranoia. Vanessa found Luca standing alone inside the downstairs bar shortly afterward. A glass remained untouched beside him, while rain hammered softly against the windows beyond. He looked emotionally hollow tonight. Not furious. Worse. Defeated. That frightened her more than violence ever had. Because men like Luca Moretti did not know how surviving failure emotionally worked. That was the emotional hook. Because powerful people often collapse hardest when they stop believing in themselves. You can't blame yourself for everything, Vanessa said quietly. Luca laughed softly without humor. I built this world. The answer carried enough self-hatred to silence the room briefly. Vanessa stepped closer slowly. You also built walls around yourself. Luca looked toward her carefully. That kept us alive. That kept you alone. The words landed heavily between them, because both knew they were true. That was the intellectual hook. Because emotional isolation eventually destroys even successful people from the inside. Luca lowered his gaze briefly. For years, I thought being feared meant being respected. Vanessa watched him carefully now. And now, Luca's voice roughened slightly beneath exhaustion. Now I think people stay because they were afraid to leave. The realization devastated him quietly, because it forced him to confront something painful. His empire never truly loved him. It feared him. And fear disappeared quickly once weakness appeared. That was the emotional hook. Because people who build relationships through intimidation eventually face emotional emptiness alone. Vanessa sat beside him slowly. For several moments, neither spoke. But this silence felt different from the cold silences inside their marriage years earlier. This silence carried understanding instead of distance. That was the intellectual hook. because emotional connection often begins once people stop defending themselves constantly. "You're tired," Vanessa said softly. Luca nodded once, not denying it anymore. That alone showed change, because the old Luca would have hidden exhaustion beneath pride immediately. That was the emotional hook, because healing begins the moment people stop pretending they are invincible. Vanessa looked toward the rain outside the windows. "You spent years trying to control everything." Luca stared forward silently. "I know. And now—" His answer came quietly. "Now I'm terrified control was the only thing holding this empire together." The honesty inside the confession unsettled her deeply, because Luca no longer sounded like a feared Don tonight. He sounded like a lonely man drowning beneath the consequences of his own life. That was the intellectual hook, because self-awareness becomes painful once people finally see the emotional damage they cause themselves. Over the following days, Vanessa slowly became the one steady thing inside Luca's collapsing world, not through romance, through presence. She stayed beside him during tense nights filled with security briefings. She listened while frustration and exhaustion slowly stripped away the emotional armor he spent years building. And Luca, for perhaps the first time in his life, allowed someone to see him emotionally unguarded. That terrified him almost as much as losing his empire. That was the emotional hook, because vulnerability feels dangerous to people raised believing weakness gets destroyed. One night, Luca finally admitted something aloud he had likely feared his entire life. "I think you were right about me." Vanessa looked toward him quietly. "About what?" Luca's expression darkened painfully. "That this life turns people into monsters." The room fell silent afterward, because a fear inside his voice sounded genuine. Luca truly believed he might already be beyond saving emotionally. That realization hurt Vanessa unexpectedly. That was the intellectual hook, because people become most dangerous after losing hope in themselves. Vanessa moved closer carefully. "You're not beyond change." Luca looked at her slowly. "But what if changing destroys everything?" The question carried deeper meaning than empire alone. He meant himself too, because Luca no longer knew who he was without fear controlling everything around him. That was the emotional hook, because people built around power often lose their identity once power starts slipping away. Outside the mansion walls, tension continued escalating rapidly. Several Moretti businesses burned overnight. Financial allies switched sides quietly. Rumors spread across the city that Luca Moretti had become emotionally unstable because of Vanessa, and rumors inside criminal worlds became deadly quickly. That was the intellectual hook, because perception destroys powerful leaders faster than violence sometimes can. Then came the final betrayal. Late one evening, Luca's head of internal security arrived carrying surveillance evidence recovered from intercepted communications. The traitor existed inside the mansion itself. Someone close enough to know Vanessa's routines, close enough to bypass security, close enough to expose her directly to Vincent Cruz. Luca reviewed the evidence silently. Then something inside him turned cold again, not emotionally numb, protectively lethal, because betrayal inside his home changed everything. That was the emotional hook, because dangerous men become most terrifying when someone threatens the people they love directly. Vanessa entered the office moments later and immediately sensed a shift in him. The exhaustion remained, but underneath it now, rage had returned, controlled, focused, deadly. "What happened?" she asked carefully. Luca looked toward her slowly, and the fear inside his eyes told her the answer before he spoke. "Someone inside my organization betrayed us." Vanessa's pulse sharpened instantly. Luca stepped closer. "They gave Vincent your location schedules." Cold panic spread through her chest immediately, because this was no longer random danger. Someone close to Luca had intentionally marked her as a target. That was the intellectual hook, because betrayal becomes horrifying once danger comes from inside trusted walls. Luca's jaw tightened violently as he looked toward the security files spread across the desk. For years he ruled through fear, believing it guaranteed loyalty. Now fear itself had poisoned everything around him. And worst of all, Vanessa was trapped in the middle of the collapse. That realization hardened something dangerous inside Luca completely, Because when powerful men lose trust in everyone around them, they become capable of anything. And somewhere beyond the mansion walls, Vincent Cruz already knew the betrayal worked. Because Vanessa Moretti had become the target once again. He spent years trying to own her, until losing her taught him how to truly love her. The Moretti mansion no longer felt like a place built for power. It felt like a place trying to survive. Security remained everywhere. Armed guards rotated through endless shifts. Surveillance screens covered walls inside private offices, while reports of betrayal and attacks continued spreading across Luca Moretti's weakening empire. But despite all the danger surrounding them, something between Luca and Vanessa had finally begun changing. Not dramatically, quietly, honestly. That was the emotional hook. Because the strongest relationships are not rebuilt through grand gestures. They are rebuilt through consistent emotional truth. Vanessa noticed a difference first in the smallest moments. Luca stopped asking where she was going, stopped monitoring every conversation, stopped surrounding her with silent pressure disguised as protection. For years, his love looked like control, because control was the only language he understood emotionally. Now, he was learning something harder. Letting go, that was the intellectual hook. Because emotionally damaged people often believe freedom will make everyone leave them. One morning, Vanessa walked alone through the state gardens for the first time in months, without guards following directly behind her. Security still existed at a distance. But Luca had changed the rules personally. Not because the danger disappeared, because he finally understood something painful. Protecting Vanessa meant nothing if she no longer felt human inside his world. That realization cost him emotionally, but he accepted it anyway. That was the emotional hook. Because real love begins the moment someone chooses your happiness over their control. Vanessa paused near the marble fountain while sunlight spread softly across the estate grounds. For the first time in years, she could breathe. Not completely. Fear still existed. The empire still trembled around them. Vincent Cruz still hunted weakness. But emotionally, something inside the mansion had shifted, and that frightened her in an entirely different way. Because hope felt dangerous after years of disappointment. That was the intellectual hook. Because people hurt repeatedly often fear hope more than pain. Inside the mansion, Lucas stood alone near the office windows, watching Vanessa from a distance across the gardens below. Not possessively, almost carefully, like a man afraid of damaging something fragile if he touched it too forcefully again. That alone revealed how deeply he had changed. The old Luca believed love meant ownership. This version finally understood love required trust. That was the emotional hook, because emotional growth becomes real when behavior changes without needing praise. Luca's empire continued weakening around him meanwhile. Several captains abandoned operations completely. Financial allies secretly shifted support toward rival organizations. Longtime business partners questioned Luca's judgment openly for the first time in years. And Luca allowed it, because none of it terrified him as much as losing Vanessa permanently. That realization still stunned him sometimes. The city he once ruled through fear suddenly mattered less than one woman quietly walking through a garden. That was the intellectual hook. Because love rearranges priorities in ways power never can. Late that evening, Vanessa entered Luca's office carrying untouched tea she knew he would otherwise ignore for another night. He looked exhausted again. Maps, surveillance files, and betrayal reports covered the massive desk around him. But unlike before, he no longer looked emotionally cold, just tired, humanly tired. Vanessa placed the tea beside him quietly. "You haven't eaten." Luca glanced toward her slowly. For several seconds, he simply watched her, and Vanessa noticed something painful in his expression. Gratitude, as if small acts of care still surprised him emotionally. That realization hurt more than she expected. That was the emotional hook. Because people raised without love often stop expecting kindness entirely. "You should sleep," she said softly. Luca leaned back heavily into the chair. "If I sleep, people make mistakes. You're not a machine." A faint, humorless smile touched his expression briefly. "Most people spent years treating me like one." Vanessa studied him carefully in the dim office lighting. For the first time, Luca looked less like a feared Don and more like a lonely man carrying the weight of an empire he no longer believed in completely. That was the intellectual hook. Because powerful people often lose themselves inside the identities they build for survival. Luca looked down at the files covering his desk. I spent my whole life believing fear kept people loyal. Vanessa remained quiet. Luca's voice lowered slightly. But fear only keeps people obedient until they stop being afraid. The honesty inside the statement carried exhaustion deeper than physical fatigue. Because Luca was finally confronting the truth about his entire life. His empire was never built on love, only fear. And fear collapsed quickly once weakness appeared. That was the emotional hook. Because empires built without emotional connection eventually leave people completely alone. Vanessa moved slowly toward the large windows overlooking the city skyline. You weren't always this man. Luca's eyes lifted toward her immediately. What if I was? The question carried genuine fear. Not fear of enemies. Fear of himself. That unsettled Vanessa deeply. Because beneath Luca's ruthless reputation existed someone emotionally terrified of becoming irredeemable. That was the intellectual hook. Because self-awareness becomes painful once people recognize the damage they cause others. Vanessa turned toward him fully now. When I first met you, you still knew how to care about people. Luca looked away briefly. That was before power. No, she answered quietly. That was before fear controlled everything. The words settled heavily between them, because deep down, Luca knew she understood him better than anyone alive. That frightened him emotionally. That was the emotional hook. Because being truly understood feels vulnerable to people who spent years hiding emotionally. Over the following days, their relationship continued changing slowly. Not through dramatic romance. Through honesty. Luca stopped avoiding difficult emotional conversations. Vanessa stopped hiding every fear behind silence. And somewhere inside that painful honesty, trust slowly began rebuilding itself. That was the intellectual hook. Because mature love is not built through perfection. It is built through emotional transparency. One rainy afternoon, Vanessa found Luca alone in the private chapel attached quietly behind the state grounds. The sight surprised her immediately. Luca Moretti never appeared emotionally reflective before. Yet now he sat silently beneath stained glass windows with exhaustion shadowing every part of him. That was the emotional hook. Because broken people often search for peace only after violence stops protecting them emotionally. He noticed her presence, but didn't move immediately. Vanessa sat beside him carefully. For several moments, rain echoed softly against the chapel roof, while silence settled naturally between them. Then Luca finally spoke. I used to think loving someone meant keeping them close no matter what. Vanessa listened quietly. Luca's voice roughened slightly beneath the weight of the confession. But all I really did was suffocate you. The honesty inside the statement struck painfully deep, because Luca no longer defended himself automatically. He accepted responsibility now. That was the intellectual hook. Because emotional maturity begins the moment people stop protecting their own ego first. Vanessa looked toward the rain outside. You loved me the only way you knew how. Luca shook his head slowly. That doesn't excuse it. No, she admitted softly, but it explains it. The difference mattered. And Luca understood that immediately. That was the emotional hook. Because understanding someone's pain does not erase damage, but it changes how healing begins. Luca finally looked directly at her. If you still want to leave after this ends. His voice hesitated slightly, then continued anyway. I'll let you go. The sentence shattered something inside Vanessa emotionally. Because for years Luca would have burned the world before surrendering control over anything he loved. Now he was offering freedom, even if it destroyed him personally. That was the intellectual hook. Because real love cannot exist beside emotional imprisonment. Vanessa searched his expression carefully. And for the first time, she saw no manipulation, only fear. Fear that she might still choose life without him. And love strong enough to accept it anyway. That realization changed everything. That was the emotional hook. Because true sacrifice begins when someone values your happiness above their own need to keep you. Weeks earlier, Vanessa wanted nothing except escape. Now, she no longer knew what leaving would mean emotionally. Because Luca had finally become the man she spent years hoping still existed beneath the violence and control that terrified her almost as much as loving him again. That was the intellectual hook. Because second chances feel dangerous once people know how badly love can fail. Meanwhile, the empire continued collapsing faster around them. Traitors inside Luca's organization multiplied. Vincent Cruz tightened pressure across financial operations. Loyal captains disappeared or secretly negotiated protection elsewhere. War was approaching openly now, and everyone inside the city felt it. That was the emotional hook, because dangerous systems become most unstable right before collapse. Late one evening, Vanessa entered Luca's office and found him burning confidential files inside the fireplace. One by one, entire operations, financial records, violent networks, years of criminal structure disappearing into flames. Vanessa stared silently. "You're destroying parts of the empire." Luca didn't look away from the fire. "I'm destroying the parts that made me someone you feared." The answer hit harder than she expected, because he truly meant it. Luca Moretti was dismantling pieces of his own power willingly. For her, for them. That was the intellectual hook. Because people only change completely after deciding something matters more than power itself. Vanessa stepped closer slowly, and for the first time in years, she touched his hand first. Small movement, but intentional. Luca looked at her immediately, almost startled by the gesture. That reaction alone revealed how emotionally uncertain he still felt around love now. That was the emotional hook, because emotionally neglected people often stop believing they deserve affection. Vanessa held his gaze quietly. "You're not the man you used to be anymore." Luca's voice lowered carefully. "Is that enough?" The question carried years of regret beneath it. Vanessa didn't answer immediately, because healing still hurt. Trust still felt fragile. But for the first time, hope felt possible too. That was the intellectual hook. Because rebuilding love requires people to risk emotional disappointment again willingly. Outside the mansion walls, thunder rolled heavily across the city, while armed guards tightened security around the estate once more. Something was coming. Everyone felt it. And deep inside the collapsing Moretti Empire, Vincent Cruz prepared the final move carefully. Because powerful enemies become most dangerous after realizing emotional transformation made someone vulnerable again. Inside the office, Luca and Vanessa stood silently beside the firelight together. No control, no ownership, only honesty finally existing between them. And just when they finally chose each other again, Vincent Cruz launched the final attack against Luca's family. The divorce papers meant to end their marriage became the reason the Ruthless Dawn finally became human. The final attack began before sunrise, not with gunfire, with silence. The Moretti mansion felt wrong the moment Luca woke. Years inside organized crime had sharpened his instinct beyond logic, and now every instinct inside him screamed the same warning. Something had already moved against them. That was the emotional hook, because people who survive violent worlds learn to recognize danger before evidence appears. Lucas stood near the bedroom window overlooking the estate grounds, while rain clouds darkened the city skyline beyond the gates. Security guards rotated through positions below, but tension moved differently across the property this morning. Sharper, uneasy, fearful. Then his phone rang. One sentence changed everything. Vincent's men breached the western checkpoint. Luca's entire body went still. Not shocked, prepared. Because deep down, he always knew this war would eventually reach his home directly. That was the intellectual hook. Because enemies stop fighting for territory once emotional destruction becomes the real objective. Vanessa woke moments later and immediately recognized the expression on Luca's face. Calm, cold, dangerously calm. But beneath the control now, fear still existed. Fear for her. That realization hurt more than panic itself. "What happened?" she asked quietly. Luca turned toward her slowly. Vincent made his move. The words settled heavily between them. Not dramatic. Final. That was the emotional hook. Because some moments arrive carrying the feeling that life will never return to what it was before. Within minutes, the mansion transformed into controlled chaos. Armed guards flooded hallways. Security systems locked automatically across the estate. Vehicles moved through the property, while reports continued arriving from different parts of the city. Vincent Cruz launched coordinated attacks against Moretti businesses overnight. Warehouses burned. Financial accounts disappeared. Allied captains vanished. Years of Luca's empire collapsed simultaneously, and all of it centered around one objective: destroying Luca emotionally through Vanessa. That was the intellectual hook, because intelligent enemies attack the heart of a man long before attacking the man himself. Vanessa stood inside the upstairs hallway, watching the empire unravel around her in real time. This was the world she spent years fearing. Violence, power, fear controlling every decision. Yet something inside her had changed too, because for the first time, she no longer wanted to run. That realization surprised even her. That was the emotional hook, because strength is not always escaping danger. Sometimes it is refusing to let fear decide your life anymore. Luca entered the hallway moments later, while several armed men followed behind him, waiting for instructions. The old Luca would have ordered Vanessa locked inside the secure room downstairs immediately, would have controlled every movement, every decision. But this version stopped directly in front of her instead, and asked quietly, "What do you want to do?" The question nearly shattered her emotionally, because Luca Moretti had finally learned something no one thought possible. Love could not survive without choice. That was the intellectual hook, because emotional growth becomes real once control turns into respect. Vanessa looked directly into his eyes. "I'm not leaving you." Luca's expression changed instantly. Not relief, something deeper, pain mixed with gratitude, because after everything he put her through, she still chose him willingly. That realization humbled him completely. That was the emotional hook, because being chosen freely means more than obedience ever could. Outside the estate walls, the city descended into quiet war. Moretti loyalists clashed with Vincent Cruz's forces across financial districts, shipping routes, and private compounds hidden throughout the city. Police avoided involvement entirely. Politicians stayed silent. Everyone understood the same thing. This was no longer business. It was personal. That made it far more dangerous. That was the intellectual hook, because personal wars destroy people faster than professional ones. Inside the mansion office, Luca reviewed final intelligence reports while rain hammered against the tall windows surrounding the room. Vincent Cruz planned one final direct strike. Not against money, not against territory, against family, against Vanessa. Luca closed the report slowly, then made the most difficult decision of his life. That was the emotional hook, because real sacrifice begins when people choose love over power completely. For years, Luca protected his empire before anything else. Now, he was willing to destroy the empire itself if it guaranteed Vanessa's safety. That truth no longer frightened him. It clarified everything. Luca looked toward his remaining loyal men gathered inside the office. "We end this tonight." No hesitation remained inside his voice, because there was nothing left worth saving except her. That was the intellectual hook, because priorities become simple once people finally understand what matters most. The hours that followed unfolded with violent precision. Luca abandoned multiple financial operations intentionally, sacrificing millions to force Vincent into predictable movement patterns. Safe houses were evacuated, smuggling routes destroyed. Years of criminal infrastructure disappeared in a single night because Luca no longer cared about preserving power. Only survival, only Vanessa. That change shocked everyone around him, because ruthless men rarely surrender power voluntarily. That was the emotional hook, because love transforms people most deeply when they willingly give up the things they once worshipped. Vanessa watched the destruction of Luca's empire quietly from inside the secured estate, and for the first time, she truly understood the weight he carried all these years. Fear, isolation, pressure, a life where weakness invited destruction instantly. No wonder he learned control before vulnerability. That realization did not excuse his past, but it finally helped her understand it completely. That was the intellectual hook, because understanding someone's emotional damage changes how you see their mistakes. Night fell heavily across the city. Rain continued endlessly while Luca prepared personally for the final confrontation with Vincent Cruz. Vanessa found him alone downstairs near the armored vehicles, waiting outside the estate gates. The atmosphere surrounding him felt different tonight. Not like a mafia don preparing for war, like a man preparing to protect the only thing he truly loved. That was the emotional hook, because people become most human at the exact moment they risk everything emotionally. You don't have to do this alone, Vanessa said softly. Luca looked toward her immediately. Yes, I do. Not because he wanted distance. Because he finally understood protecting her did not mean controlling her life anymore. It meant carrying the danger himself when necessary. That was the intellectual hook. Because mature love protects people without removing their freedom. Vanessa stepped closer carefully. Years ago, she would have feared this version of Luca. Tonight, she saw something else entirely. A man stripped emotionally bare by love, regret, and fear of losing her. That vulnerability changed him more than violence ever had. That was the emotional hook. Because vulnerability becomes transformative once people stop hiding behind power. Luca reached slowly into his jacket pocket before placing something carefully into Vanessa's hands. The divorce papers. Still folded. Still unsigned. Vanessa stared down at them silently. Luca's voice lowered beneath the sound of rain. If I don't come back... Vanessa looked up immediately. You will. But Luca continued anyway. You choose your life after this. Not me. Never me again. The words carried complete surrender. No control. No emotional chains. Only love finally existing honestly. That realization nearly broke her. That was the intellectual hook. Because true love gives people freedom, even when freedom risks losing them. Vanessa looked at the papers again. The same papers she once believed would save her life. Now they felt like reminders of how emotionally lost both of them had once been. That was the emotional hook. Because sometimes relationships die emotionally long before people stop loving each other. Hours later, Luca confronted Vincent Cruz inside an abandoned shipping terminal near the harbor, while storms rolled violently across the city. The final meeting carried no negotiation, only ending. Vincent stood surrounded by armed men, while rain soaked the concrete around them. Yet Luca walked forward without hesitation, because fear disappeared once people accepted what they were willing to lose. That was the intellectual hook. Because dangerous men become unstoppable after deciding something matters more than survival itself. Vincent smiled coldly. You destroyed your own empire for one woman. Luca's expression never changed. No, his voice remained calm. I destroyed it because the empire turned me into someone she feared. The answer unsettled even Vincent briefly. Because this was no longer the ruthless Don everyone expected. This was someone transformed by emotional truth that made him unpredictable. That was the emotional hook. Because changed men are more dangerous than ruthless ones. The violence erupted seconds later. Gunfire shattered through the storm, while Luca's remaining loyal forces closed around the terminal from every direction. Betrayals ended brutally. Vincent's network collapsed piece by piece as years of fear-based alliances finally broke apart under pressure. But Luca cared about none of it. His focus remained singular. End the threat. Protect Vanessa. That was the intellectual hook. Because love simplifies priorities in ways power never can. The conflict ended before dawn. Vincent Cruz disappeared permanently from the city's power structure. His surviving men surrendered, vanished, or changed loyalties immediately after realizing Luca Moretti no longer fought for empire. He fought for family. That difference changed everything. That was the emotional hook. Because men protecting loved ones fight differently than men protecting power. By morning, the city understood the truth. The Moretti Empire survived, but transformed completely. Several criminal operations disappeared permanently. Financial corruption routes collapsed intentionally. Violent enforcement structures dissolved under Luca's direct orders. For the first time in years, fear no longer controlled the organization completely. Luca changed the rules publicly. No more loyalty through terror alone. No more emotional isolation disguised as strength. People around him struggled understanding the transformation. But Vanessa understood, because she witnessed what caused it. Love, loss, and almost losing each other forever. That was the intellectual hook. Because emotional pain changes people more permanently than violence ever does. Several days later, Sunlight finally returned to the city after endless storms. Vanessa stood quietly near the mansion garden while a soft wind moved through the trees surrounding the estate. The mansion itself felt different now, still powerful, still guarded, but no longer emotionally cold. Footsteps approached slowly behind her. Luca, Vanessa turned toward him calmly. For several moments, neither spoke. They no longer needed dramatic declarations. Too much truth already existed between them now. That was the emotional hook. Because mature love becomes quieter once people stop hiding emotionally. Luca stepped beside her carefully, not controlling, not demanding, simply present. "I can't undo the years I hurt you," he said quietly. Vanessa looked toward the sunlight stretching across the gardens. "I know." Silence settled softly between them. Then Luca spoke again. "But I'll spend the rest of my life trying to love you better than I did before." The honesty inside the statement carried no pride, only truth, and for the first time in years, Vanessa finally felt seen emotionally, not admired, not possessed, loved. That realization healed something inside her slowly. That was the intellectual hook, because emotional safety matters more than luxury ever will. Vanessa looked down at the divorce papers still resting folded inside her hands. Then slowly, she tore them apart. Not because pain never happened, not because everything became perfect, but because both of them finally understood something they spent years missing. Love survived, even beneath silence, even beneath fear, even beneath power. That was the emotional hook. Because sometimes people only understand love after standing on the edge of losing it forever. Luca watched the torn papers disappear into the wind silently, and for the first time in his life, the ruthless Don did not feel powerful. He felt human. Vanessa stepped closer beside him while sunlight finally broke through the clouds covering the estate. Their future remained imperfect. Healing would take time. Trust would continue rebuilding slowly. But now, they would choose it together. Because she once held divorce papers believing their marriage was already dead. But the moment the ruthless Don begged her stay, both of them realized love had survived beneath all the silence, pain, and power all along.